Okay, it is 12 o'clock, so we'll go ahead and get started. I'm Claire Jantz. I'm the director of the Center for Land Use and Sustainability, and I'm excited to welcome you to our Planning for Solar in South Central Pennsylvania. This is one of two seminars that the CLUS is hosting focused on solar because it is a growing industry in Pennsylvania and has a lot of land use impacts. For those of you who are joining us on Zoom, please let us know if there's any technical difficulties on your end. We do have people monitoring the Q&A. And as we're going through, please pop questions into your Q&A and we'll be able to take questions from those of you on Zoom, as well as those of us in the audience. So the reason that we were motivated to do this program at this time is because Pennsylvania is on the verge of a significant expansion in solar energy production. In general, Pennsylvania has a very strong energy production history. We're currently fourth nationwide in terms of energy production. Currently, most of that energy production in Pennsylvania is produced through fossil fuels. We only have about 4% of our electricity production from renewables, and of that 4%, only about 8% from solar. And we're actually, in terms of the number of utility scale solar generators in Pennsylvania, we have about 40, and that ranks us 45th out of 50 in terms of the number of utility scale solar fields in Pennsylvania. So that being said, since about 2006 nationwide, solar capacity has increased by about 10,000%. And there's over 400 proposed solar projects in the pipeline in Pennsylvania right now. So it's a concern across the board. You know, there's obviously a lot of support for renewable energy, but at the same time, this presents a lot of issues related to land use. And so for our first seminar on solar, we wanted to talk with some folks who have been working on local planning tools for solar development, because as many of you know, all land use planning in Pennsylvania happens at the local scale across thousands of local municipalities. So without wasting any more time, I want to introduce our panelists today. We're joined by Katie Hess, who is a very good friend and the director of the South Mountain Partnership. She's also the co-founder and director of the Appalachian Trail Conservancy's on-the-ground landscape conservation program. Katie has 15 years of experience in this realm of connecting people and organizations with the knowledges and resources needed to overcome challenges. Katie is a longtime local. She's a native of South Central Pennsylvania, and we're glad that she has remained in South Central Pennsylvania. Prior to joining the ATC, she managed GIS and mapping data for cultural resources at the Pennsylvania State Historic Preservation Office, and she holds a Master of Landscape Architecture from the Stuckman, okay, School of Arts and Architecture at Penn State University. So we'll be starting out with Katie. Following Katie, we'll be hearing from Steve Hoffman, who I'm glad to say is a SHPE alum who earned his bachelor's and his master's degree at Shippensburg University in the Geoenvironmental Studies program. So he's one of our personal people. He currently works at Cumberland County as a planner. His work experience focuses largely on land development review and approval. He has over 10 years of experience with county planning and over 10 years experience with civil engineering firms that focus on land development submissions and approvals. And then last but not least, we have Sam Weiser, who provides legal services in the areas of municipal law, zoning, and land use. environmental law, and general litigation. He serves as the chair of the Saltzman Hughes Municipal Practice Group, and that team represents over 100 municipal entities throughout the Commonwealth. And certainly if you're involved in land use in South Central Pennsylvania, you're certainly familiar with the Saltzman Hughes team. Okay, so those are our brief introductions. Katie, would you like to take it away?
Absolutely. Do I need to speak into the microphone?
That'll broadcast. Yeah.
Yes. Okay.
You don't have to pull, maybe you can, yeah.
Okay, we'll just pull this between
Yep,
the two
there
of
you
us.
go.
Hopefully that will be all right. And about how many people do we have online?
In
with
the
us?
chat right now, we have
About 20.
20.
Okay, well, great. Thanks.
25.
Okay, thanks all for joining us. And again, my name is Katie Hess, and I am an employee of the Appalachian Trail Conservancy and direct the South Mountain Partnership, which is one of Pennsylvania's 8 conservation landscapes. That means that we are in partnership also with the Department of Conservation and Natural Resources, who started that conservation landscape program to engage people in stewardship and conservation outside of the traditional state park and forest boundaries. So we've been doing that work for about 17 years now, and we've evolved into an organization that is run more like a network of people. And our core purpose is to convene people, to bring them together, to talk about what we value about the region. And that region is parts of Adams, Cumberland, Franklin, and York counties. And what steps need to be taken in order to preserve what we have, all the great things that we have, and still allow us to move forward together into the future. And we want to have a sustainable future with well-planned growth and economic development. So that sort of brings me to our role here in solar development. Back in 2020, I believe, some of our committee members kept bringing to us concern about the uptick in solar development proposals that they were fielding, and that municipalities in their areas were struggling to either accommodate or to fend off. You know, the municipalities, in short, were having trouble doing what they wanted to do in relation to solar development. And so it was recommended that we start concentrating more on this. So we held one of our 2 annual regional meetings with a focus on solar development. We brought Penn State Center for Marcellus Shale Energy Development together with Greenworks Development, which is a solar development firm, and PASA, Sustainable Agriculture, to speak with the region about what is solar development, why should we be concerned in this region, and what steps do we need to take next. And it was there that we learned, sort of like what Claire mentioned, that we will be a hotspot for solar development. It is anticipated that we'll be one of 2 hotspots in South Central Pennsylvania. And just a little further, to call your attention to, Pennsylvania's Solar Future Plan calls for 10% of our in-state electric consumption to be generated by in-state solar works by 2030. This will require 11 gigawatts of solar power. That is estimated to require 86,000 acres of solar development fields, just the solar arrays, I believe, not counting the additional infrastructure needed. And a 2008 study anticipated that if we were to use much of the rooftops that we already have in Pennsylvania, we could generate 27 gigawatts, over twice what the state wants us to have by 2030. So just a little bit of context to bring us into. So we're faced with this. We know there's going to be an uptick in solar development. The state's going to drive incentive for solar development because of our geographic location and our low, in context, low land rates, low cost of land. That's going to contribute. So we brought together partners. Fast forward, we learned that we really needed to engage partners who knew a whole lot more about this than us. And in short, we developed a solar work group, and we brought together cross-industry expertise, anyone from agriculture to tourism bureaus, economic development corporations, planning offices, municipal representatives, to talk about where are we headed and what do we need to do. South Mountain Partnership did set out a charter stating our position, which is we do support solar development, but we do have concerns about how it will be implemented. And we simply want to strike a balance between that development and all of the great things that we already have. So some of our leading players are here today. Steve and Sam were integral in starting to develop model ordinance language and on our behalf or on behalf of the region. And so they and their organizations actually deserve much of the credit for the outcomes so far from this solar work group. And the discussion that we initially had, if you guys will recall, was that the South Mountain Partnership has identified that this region is special and unique because of our our agricultural resources, our cultural and historic ones, our natural resources like air, wildlife habitat, and our recreational resources like the National Appalachian Scenic Trail, all of our trails and parks and things like this, our views. And we wanted to be able to translate protection for those types of resources into ordinances. And I've been off for the last few months having my first baby. So at this point, I'm going to sort of shift it over to them to kind of tell their story and give a brief update about the work that has been accomplished. And maybe we can start with you, Steve, since I know you said that Cumberland County has actually adopted your version of the ordinance.
So I was actually in the process of starting a model ordinance when I was contacted by Katie and the South Mountain Partnership. We were able to then work with the partnership, get a lot more feedback, and I was introduced to Sam through the process. And we have finished the county's model ordinance at this time, and now we're working with the other members of South Mountain Partnership to get that finalized into an actual document for them. So next. One of the big things I had to wrestle with was, is solar energy positive or negative? Solar energy is a renewable resource. It's clean. It can be sold to power companies. It can reuse old abandoned industrial sites. It can be located on rooftops where there's very low impact. And it can consume farmland. It can interrupt and impact view sheds. Solar energy, it costs a lot of money up front. It increases stormwater runoff. So there are good and bad to solar energy. So what we made, and actually this was Sam's idea, so I will give him credit, a little bit of a kind of an a la carte ordinance. If you go to the next slide. So my thought is, hey, these municipalities who actually enforce the laws should work with their residents and their stakeholders and determine what exactly do they want. I mean, if the municipality really wants to preserve the open space and the view sheds and the ag land, they should have more restrictions on solar. However, if they want to encourage a clean energy source, then they should have less restrictions on solar. So I put together an ordinance. It's going to require a lot of work. I'll be honest. It's not something that these municipalities can just say, okay, we'll sign it and adopt it. The ordinance has a lot of text that's designed to be tailored. Some of it is optional. Some of it gives a range for just a quick example, setbacks. I don't say that you should have a setback of 50 feet. I say 30 to 60. The municipality can figure out what they want from the ordinance. And I think that's important. So it will suit municipalities on both sides of that opinion. So here are some examples of the ordinance language. Almost every model and ordinance I've seen regulate signage. It's very, very typical language. You can't advertise on the signs. It's limited to the manufacturer and the power purchaser. So I did have a chance to visit the Nittany One solar farm, which is actually in Franklin County. The Nittany One solar farm, it's a very large, it was agricultural land. It's now a solar farm. It was really interesting to see how it all works and how it went together and some of the things they did on the site. And there's lots of pictures coming from that site. One of the biggest questions that people ask is about stormwater. So first of all, it's not just the solar panels that need to be considered. There are access roads and there are buildings that need to be considered as well. So the big question, and I've heard both sides of this, is are the solar panels impervious and do they need to regulate stormwater? So I found that the Pennsylvania DEP, the Department of Environmental Protection, has actually issued a frequently asked questions statement. And in that statement, they say, hey, if you can do A, B, C, D, and E, then we don't consider your solar panels to be impervious. So you don't have to do your post-construction stormwater management plan. You don't have to go through that process and get that approval. So what I did in our model, I actually put those requirements in the model. And again, it's an option because the other option is, hey, it's impervious no matter what you do. So I put it in as an option for the municipalities to consider, hey, if DEP says it's not impervious, then we're not going to call it impervious either. Now, DEP does have, again, A, B, C, D, and E that you have to follow for them not to be impervious. It includes the grass can never be shorter than 4 inches. You have to have space between panels to allow for vegetation and the water runoff to reach the vegetation and infiltrate into the ground. The height of the panel, this was an interesting one. The height of the panel is limited off the ground, which kind of directly butts head with the agrivoltaics, which agrivoltaics is can you go to the next slide?
Yeah.
Agrivoltaics is, hey, we're going to have a solar farm, but we're also going to use the same land for agriculture. So DEP says you can only have this, I think it's 3 or 4 feet off the ground. I don't remember the exact number, but it's hard to have livestock or plants or crops if they have to be that close to the ground. Most places to get farm equipment or animals for agrivoltaics, they want it to be higher up. So they do kind of butt heads a little bit, but agrivoltaics is really neat. During the tour of this solar farm that I mentioned, I got to meet some folks from BP. They were the ones who operate this system, and they had their favorite animals and their least favorite animals. And I thought it was really fun. They said, we don't like goats. So we don't like goats because goats like to climb up on everything. They like to be high up and they break our panels. No goats. And so what else is bad? And they said, well, we don't like cows either because cows like to scratch their backs on everything. And that's very true. Cows will rub on anything just to scratch their back. And they said, the cows will rub against the panels and there's gears that, these panels follow the sun and all those things can be damaged from cows rubbing against them. But their favorite livestock is sheep. Sheep, they don't like to be high. They can't reach very tall. So sheep is their favorite. And if you see on this screen, under those panels, can you see the white dots there? They are actually hundreds of sheep. And they manage the sheep. If you look right in front of the picture, there's a little tiny white fence. And they actually manage so that when it gets down to about 4 inches, they come with and they move the sheep over to the next section. And then they rotate them all around. And it's really useful. And by the end of the growing season, the sheep are removed. And then the next spring, more sheep come in. So it was really interesting. Crops for agrivoltaics are challenging only because of the shade. And if you follow the DEP requirements, you're not allowed to plow. It has to be no-till. But if you do want to plow, you have to be careful because some of the solar panels require utilities to be underground. Well, you can't plow if there's wiring underground. So again, there's a lot to work through in the model ordinance and with DEP and what you can do with the site. Go to the next slide. For, as far as zoning districts, basically, we're saying that if it's not a residential district or it's not a conservation area on the side of a mountain, you should allow solar panels. Now, this does not limit accessory solar panels. Accessory panels should be permitted everywhere because that's just a panel on your roof. But as far as a principal use, I'm not embarrassed at all. I'm sorry. As far as the accessory use, they should be permitted in all zones because they can be attached to a roof. Principal use, we recommend that they're permitted in non-residential zones and not necessarily on the side of the mountain. Now, I spoke with people at the industry during this tour, and they're like, I know nobody wants to hear this, but we like farmland. They like land that's very flat. They like land that has no vegetation, and they like land that directly gets sunlight. So they don't want to be on the side of the mountain. They want to be flat. They like farmland. They like rooftops. But with rooftops, a lot of buildings that are existing maybe aren't designed to hold those panels. So it's a balancing act with that. So in our model ordinance, what we've done is we've given incentive for people to put panels on buildings. And we've given, we've also offered an incentive. If you can say, hey, we're going to put our panels so that the prime ag land is preserved, and you can still maneuver farm equipment in there to plow it, then you can cover more of the other land. So what we've done is saying if you can do A, B, and C, then you can, the remaining land can have more coverage. And again, these are all options, and Sam really helped me with that language. I don't want to take too much time. I know this is more of a question and answer thing. My next slide has my contact information. If there are questions, you can shoot an email or give me a call. I've also included a link to the model that I've been discussing on the slide. And now I believe Sam's going to give some examples of some projects he's worked on and represented.
Yeah, thank you, Steve. And that was a really good overview. I would be remiss if I didn't mention I'm a 2003 grad of Shippensburg.
Oh, that wasn't in your bio.
It was not in my bio. I apologize for that, but I got my BA here. I enjoy being back. Actually, I live right down the road. As has already been covered, solar is a relatively newer land use. And municipalities and local government aren't really that great at being proactive in addressing newer land uses. So similar things that we can look at is with the Marcellus Shale boom that happened, a lot of municipalities were very reactive to that. It happened rather quickly and unfolded quickly, and municipalities were left trying to develop regulations after the fact. We've got some of that with respect to solar. It's interesting because who would have thought that central Pennsylvania, within the South Mountain Partnership area, would be such a hotbed of solar. But in talking with some of the solar developers and talking with some of the communities that I represent, there's a couple reasons that drive that. Where does development go generally? Where there's the least path of resistance and a low land acquisition cost, right? So we're not Lancaster County where there's a higher value to the farmland where these facilities want to locate. Generally, what the easement value is these days for solar per acre for farmland is between $1,300 and $1,500 per acre is what a farmer can receive from a solar developer. There are still some municipalities in the South Mountain Partnership region that have no zoning, right? So that makes it very simple. You can put anything anywhere within that municipality. An example of some of the larger solar installations that have gone in Franklin County are in municipalities that have no zoning because there wasn't a stringent approval process or stringent regulations that they had to follow. So they followed the path of least resistance. Most municipalities have very few ordinance provisions regarding solar. That's improving. And this effort really is to try to address that. With some of the more rural municipalities, they may have a few hundred or a few thousand residents. So again, some of the larger facilities in Franklin County, you have a township that has a population base of 300. Well, that's not a very significant tax base, and they don't really have the resources to engage legal counsel or pay a solicitor to develop a progressive solar ordinance. They're really relying on efforts like this for someone to kind of provide them a model that they can adopt. So I think this effort is sorely needed. And then you have other municipalities that are a bit more sophisticated in the provisions that they've drafted. Municipalities have to allow solar somewhere. By law, you can't exclude illegal use. So that's kind of where the tension comes in, right? Where do we provide for this within our municipality? And that's where the conversation with some of the residents and the interested stakeholders come in. Some municipalities have made the choice, well, we'll allow this in the industrial area because it's a utility scale installation, right? It has a commercial or industrial purpose, and that's where we feel that it's appropriate. And in doing that, then they preserve their prime agricultural soils. Not all soils are equal. Some are of higher production value. Within the South Mountain Partnership area, we've got a varying array of soils. In Franklin County and Cumberland County, we've got some very rich limestone soils. In Adams County, we've got the redder, not so arable soils. And so we'll talk about some installations and momentarily I'll go through some examples in Adams County as well, where there's been a lot of solar development. That's the tension. And you've got the farmers who are subject to commodity markets that have been a bit wild lately in the grains, in the milk. There have been a lot of farmers that have lost their milk contracts and have sold their herd. And then you've got hundreds of acres that they're not really sure what they're going to do with it. Are they going to transition to crop farming? They're going to sell the land. A lot of times they're opposed to residential development. They want to keep it farmland. And a lot of farmers that I've talked to see this as a way to preserve the farmland for the future. They see this as a temporary measure that these facilities will be installed. They generally have a useful life of 30 to 35 years. Then after that, the posts that are driven into the ground to support these can be extracted. The topsoil is all still there, and this can be reinvigorated as farmland with very little effort. I talked to a farmer the other day who he's currently, and we'll see the project momentarily, he's one of the many property owners who have leased their land to a solar developer, and they've come in and done some minimal excavation, and they've driven some piles. And he said, Sam, I think if I had 2 to 3 years to get the nutrients back in the soil, I could get this back to where it was before I let the solar facility come in. He said, I'm not that bothered by this. Do I like the way it looks? No. Do I like the check I'm getting from the solar company? Yes. Is this permanent? No. He feels like he still has something that he can pass on to future generations if they would desire to farm. And frankly, the other challenges with smaller farms at this point are you don't have the successor generations that are as involved, and they don't want to farm. So you don't have the next generation to pass it down to, and labor is very, very difficult to come by. And so these farmers are facing some significant challenges. One of the challenges as a person who's trying to help municipalities write land use regulations are because it is a newer land use, there aren't really any court cases that guide the parameters for these land uses. What are acceptable setbacks, right? What are appropriate levels of lot coverage? And we'll talk about an example. One of my examples is a case that's currently being litigated before the Commonwealth Court for a municipality in Franklin County that took a more conservative, I would say, and in a sense, aggressive approach to the regulation of solar. One of the other concerns that municipalities have and that a lot of residents have voiced is decommissioning. So what happens after that 30 to 35 years, after the solar panels are no longer producing what they need to produce, and these panels degrade over time. The highest efficiency is at the outset, and over time they lose efficiency. So when you get out 30, 35 years, they're not producing the same amount of power as they were at the front end. So they would either need to be replaced or the facility decommissioned. As you know, with the appliance, where do you take your TVs, right? Electronics recycling is very difficult and very expensive. So there's a concern by landowners and municipalities is, okay, well, how do we know that these things are actually gonna get appropriately disposed of at the end of their useful life? What can we do as a municipality to make sure that we don't have this large solar field that's decommissioned, that's no longer providing any value to anyone in the municipality, that doesn't just sit there and continue to deteriorate? So one of the things that you'll see in the model ordinance that we have is a decommissioning bond requirement, that you come up with an estimate of what it costs to decommission now. And you can look at things such as what is the scrap value of the components of the solar panels, and you can give the solar developer a credit for that scrap value. But one of the things that was very important to me is that not stay static, right? Because we know the cost of decommissioning now won't be the cost 30 years down the road. So we have a provision by which you can re-examine that over time, whatever time is appropriate, is it 3 years, is it 5 years? Is it some other metric where you look at this and say, okay, we're going to update what the cost estimate is, and we're going to require the developer to post a new security amount. So I think that's one of the critical pieces in looking at this, is to making sure that if the goal is to return this to farmland, that actually can happen at some point. There's also state legislation right now that may impact decommissioning. The legislature has a couple solar related bills. One of them is requiring, and this scares me a little bit, preempting municipal requirements for decommissioning. The state would set the criteria by which a solar developer would provide financial security to ensure that happens. It removes some of the local control, and I'm not a huge fan of that. I like it when municipalities have the ability to, within the bounds of the law, decide what is right for their community. The other piece of legislation that hasn't quite made it through the process yet, but I think is coming and is only a matter of time. We talked about utility scale installations, but there's also a concept of community solar installations. So the utility scale installations are everything gets plugged back into the grid, right? And then gets bought by an end user or end users, as the case may be. A community solar installation is where members of the community own a part of the solar output. You can subscribe to the output of the facility. And it's a really good concept, because there are folks that can put solar panels on their house for a host of reasons. It may be cost prohibitive. They may not be in a good location for solar. There may be too much shade, but they want to do the right thing, right? They want to have some green energy, and you can subscribe to a project. But that means we're going to have a larger conglomeration of these solar facilities, right? It's going to be most cost effective whenever you can have a large scale facility that folks can subscribe to. So I think that's coming down the road. And in my view, the way that we've set the model ordinance up, regardless of whether it's utility scale or it's a large community solar facility, this model ordinance would provide for regulation of that. So with that bit of background, I'd like to look at some of the examples. So if we could look at the first slide that I have under the examples. So next slide, please. I've provided a couple different examples in different contexts of solar projects. The first is somewhat unique because right down the road, we have the borough of Chambersburg. The borough of Chambersburg is a community of about 22,000 residents. The borough of Chambersburg is somewhat unique because the borough of Chambersburg owns and operates its own electric utility. So they own the infrastructure, they own the generation. And one of the things that the borough of Chambersburg has done over the years is they've invested significantly in renewable energy projects. They have a landfill gas project. We've got a landfill in Scotland, and they have generations that burn the methane gas, then converts it to electric, that plugs into their grid, which is fantastic. And their next project was this solar project. This solar project now is fully operational. It's a 15 megawatt project. That produces approximately 10% of the borough's energy needs. So enough for about 2,200 residents within the borough. This covers 86 acres. What's somewhat unique about this project is this is located on a shale pit or a shale mine. So they didn't use tillable land. They decided they wanted to do this in a responsible way. There's an old shale pit outside of town. They talked to there's two different owners of the shale facility. They talked to those two owners. They said, hey, we'd really like to use this land that you're no longer using for mining, and we'd like to install our solar facility there. The other reason this really worked out for them, and one of the things that really drives the location of solar facilities, is an electric substation. So you've got to have a substation facility to plug your electric into. It's cost prohibitive if you have to run miles and miles and miles of feeder line to find a substation. So when we look at where these are located, there's generally a substation close by. This just happens to be next door. It's worked out really well. It's actually producing more than the 15 megawatts that they projected. They're currently producing about 17. So that project has worked out tremendously for the borough of Chambersburg. There were no complaints. Interestingly, as I mentioned, this township right outside of Chambersburg has no zoning. So there were no heightened approval processes or setbacks or other things they had to worry about. And also because it was on a mine, DEP allowed for this to happen within their mining permit, which is somewhat unique as well. So stormwater and all that were handled by the mining permit. If we can look at the next slide, this is a project in Guilford Township and I represent Guilford Township. This is currently being litigated before the Commonwealth Court. I've got two different slides here that show the scope of this project. This is a project that was proposed by Belltown Power. If you're familiar with Guilford Township, which is the township as you leave Chambersburg, you're taking 30 east towards Gettysburg. There's a very nice park facility on your right as you're driving towards Gettysburg. It's called Norlow Park. So a part of this solar facility would have overlooked Norlow Park. And the Guilford Township supervisors who have invested a lot of money into Norlow Park were very concerned about protecting that. It's a historic resource. There's historic structures on this property, and it's a significant recreational amenity. Before this project was submitted, the Guilford Township supervisors adopted an ordinance that provided significant setback requirements that are unlike what we've suggested in the model ordinance. But they adopted a 1,000-foot setback from a township park, and they adopted a 1,000-foot setback from a residential zone. And again, that's a bit more aggressive than you'll see in a lot of the land use ordinances, but they felt that's what was necessary to protect the recreational and cultural amenities as well as a residential zone. This solar facility covered about 258 acres of prime agricultural soils immediately adjacent to the township park. If we look at the next slide, it shows the lower half of this that extends down in a southward direction. The solar developer wasn't happy about the 1,000-foot setback, and they weren't happy about the lot coverage requirement that the township adopted. The township said you can't cover more than 35% of a lot with your solar facility. The developer challenged the township's ordinance and said that it's invalid because it's unreasonable, it's arbitrary, you have no basis for which you've set these setbacks, it's confiscatory, and that you've excluded us from developing this property as a solar facility because we can't make this economically work. They appealed that to the zoning hearing board. The zoning hearing board said, no, we think it's okay. We think the park setback may be a little much. You should reduce that back to 500 feet, but everything else we're good with. The solar developer then appealed that to the Court of Common Pleas, which is the next step, the Franklin County Court of Common Pleas. The Franklin County Court said, you know, this is a new and emerging land use, and we don't see anything that would prohibit a municipality from trying to come up with reasonable ways to regulate this. We think the township's ordinance is fine too. And the solar developer was not happy with that, so they appealed that to the Commonwealth Court. So now we're in the Commonwealth Court. We just had oral arguments last week, and we'll see if the Commonwealth Court gives us some direction as to whether or not a 1,000-foot setback is okay, or if it's a bit much, and whether the lot coverage requirements work. But I think this is a good example of municipalities really trying to wrestle with impact and how to appropriately deal with that. And as these cases work their way through the system, that will provide other municipalities with some guidance that they can rely on as to what parameters may be acceptable to our court system as being appropriate for these types of developments. Then I'll go to the last project, and this is the biggest of the projects that we've looked at. So this is the Adams Solar Project in Strabane Township. I also represent Strabane Township. Strabane Township had decided that it was going to allow for solar as a permitted use in the agricultural residential district. The agricultural community was, I think, largely in favor of having the option of leasing some facilities to the solar developers. This is actually a project of the city of Philadelphia. The city of Philadelphia has a goal of increasing their green energy consumption. So they partnered with an entity that developed this project. The project, I think, has been sold 4 times since its initial inception. And I think the city of Philadelphia has lamented the fact that this started, I think, 6 or 8 years ago, and this is still not operational, but it's getting closer. They're driving piles in the ground as we speak and prepping these sites. This is a 70 megawatt array, which would power approximately 22% of the city of Philadelphia's electric needs. So a large portion of their consumption would be provided by a renewable energy source. This covers 850 acres. As you can see, it is a conglomeration of parcels across a swath of the township. And you can see the small green parcel kind of to the lower left. That is where the substation is located. So you can see I call it the extension cord, the red extension cord going from the substation to either of the two conglomeration of parcels where these facilities would be located. So very large array with impacting a very large portion of farmland within Strabane Township. Strabane Township is now kind of wrestling with, and there are more projects that are proposed in Strabane, hundreds and hundreds of more acres proposed in Strabane Township. And they're wrestling with, when are we saturated, right? When do we have enough solar for Strabane Township? And they asked me the question, how much do we have to provide for, right? Well, you don't have to allocate all of your municipality to a certain use. You just have to provide for a reasonable amount of that particular land use within your municipality. My opinion, 850 acres is probably reasonable, right? We've probably reached that point, but that's a legislative policy decision for them to make. And hopefully they have some robust conversations over the next couple of months to decide how they intend to further regulate the saturation of solar within their municipality. Again, I think the focus on Adams County is the relatively lower land values when you look to the east and west. And I think we're gonna, as Dr. Jan said, there's over 450 utility scale projects in the Pennsylvania, Jersey, Maryland at PJM in the queue. I think based on some of the Penn State research, they think that perhaps 10% of those may make it through. And as mentioned before, that's about 80,000 acres of farmland or other land that's covered in solar project. So it's a big deal for the municipalities, and hopefully this resource that has been worked on by the partnership will be a tool that municipalities can use to try to mitigate the impacts of this land use. That's not commentary on whether it's a good land use or it's not, as Steve said, right? I think it's a good use, but how do you make that fit within your vision and your goals for your community? Balance. Yep.
So I will add that the next step for South Mountain Partnership is to sort of take the model ordinances that have been developed and to shop them through our committee structure and other maybe organizations or folks within our network and see what other opportunities are available for incorporating some additional conservation values, such as the Appalachian Trail Conservancy now has a viewshed assessment where we know folks from that National Scenic Trail, which is part of the National Park System, can see, glorious views of our area. And so it would be yet another tool for a municipality to voluntarily consider if they would like to incorporate that into their decision structure. Another next step is to possibly host a series of workshops like Sam referenced. A lot of these municipalities do not have the financial or perhaps people capacity to get this work through and to really facilitate the process. So we have gone to DCNR and sort of shopped around the idea of hosting workshops that would help usher them through that process, and they would be iterative, where they would be able to work with their solicitor, come back, work on the next section, and that's simply to try to help alleviate some of the financial and time burden that is associated with this. So stay tuned. And I keep looking at Elizabeth. I really want to draw attention to Elizabeth Grant. Much of what I have said has been worked on just as much as Elizabeth. She is a leadership committee member. You serve on multiple committees, but a lot of the work the South Mountain Partnership has done is in large part because of Elizabeth.
Okay. All set. Okay, we have maybe about 15 minutes for conversations. Tyler has his hand raised, Tyler Sumner. Tyler, I'm gonna unmute you. And so you can chat if you want to, like with your, verbally. And we have some questions on the Q&A. Are there any questions in the audience? Holly.
Do you want me to go or do you want Tyler to go first?
Tyler's mic is open. I wonder if he's.
Yeah, so I don't actually see my hand up on my end. So hello, everyone. Tyler Sumner, Bureau of Forestry, DCNR. I'm the DCNR internal lead, but.
Oh. Hold on, Tyler. You need to unmute yourself.
I should be unmuted now, but yes, it's nice to meet everyone, but I didn't put my hand up. It must have been the cyber gremlins that did it for me. So
okay, maybe. Yes, Sydney, the AI. Okay, Holly, go ahead.
So I'm thinking dual land use, maybe not ag and solar. I'm thinking warehouse solar. How can you talk a little bit about any progress with that? Because they take up a lot of real estate, and it would be great if that could be useful.
There are a few places in Cumberland County that have rooftop solar. The one slide I had that showed the different zones, there was a picture of the rooftop of a Target in Carlisle that has solar. There's also a warehouse located in Mechanicsburg that has solar on its rooftop. So it is there. I think that the challenge, and maybe Sam could maybe add a little to this, is getting the two to work together and dealing with liabilities and maintenance. And I think there's a lot to that, but it is encouraged in the ordinance.
Yeah, I think you've covered it. It's marrying those two together. You've got corporate behemoths that don't play well together, right? Generally, with a lot of red tape, and a lot of the older warehouses, as Steve said, they weren't designed to accommodate the roof load that solar requires, but the newer warehouse construction is. And so that's why we try to incentivize that co-location on the warehouses in our model ordinance, in the hope that that will prompt some of the use of the many millions of square feet that are already in existence along this corridor.
Okay, I think we had one question about the Sam, you had cited the 1,300 to 1,500 acre value. Is that a lease payment, like an annual
lease payment?
Lease payment, yeah. Okay. So that was a clarifying question. And we have another question from Jeannie Ortiz. She's asking, how far away from high voltage lines does a commercial solar installation need to be? Is there like a minimum or maximum distance?
I've not heard any.
Okay.
I do have a little bit of a guideline in the ordinance. And I'm not an electric guy, so this is just something I found. On page, if you go to our ordinance on page 8, I did find I cited several sources on that page, and I have a recommended proximity to the power grid table.
Okay.
So I mean, again, I'm not an expert on it. I found it in my sources and they are cited, and that's about all I can say.
And in terms of where to access that, would we be able to put that on our website or a link to?
Yes, it's actually on my slideshow.
Yeah.
And I guess I should have maybe emailed it to Claire so she could.
Well, I have it. And
if you could put it in the chat.
Yes, I have put it in the chat so that people on Zoom have the link on the chat. And Elizabeth?
Sorry, it's another question to just follow up on the transmission piece.
Okay, so I think that we can, and your information, I'll just maybe bring that slide up one more time to contact you, Steve, or South Mountain Partnership, or Plus at ship.edu. We can provide you with this with these links. Yeah.
So just to follow up on the transmission question too, as Sam, you mentioned about the requirement for a substation. Are there potential impacts to transmission as well? I know Franklin County kind of recently faced you know, a large transmission project that they successfully, you know, were able to prevent from happening. Are there expected impacts not only to the locations, but also transmission? Would those be overhead or underground?
The transmission lines are generally overhead, high voltage transmission lines. The Transforce project that you cited with the overhead power line, that conveyed power from a very long distance, and there weren't really any substations where it dropped power out or had power come in. Some of the proponents of solar see it as a more distributed generation, so that you wouldn't have as much of a need for some of the overhead transmission line. That if you've got power at a more distributed grid level, that it eliminates some of that congestion that you have. And I'm just speaking very generally. I do work with Chambersburg and their electric folks, so I've got a very limited knowledge, right, of transmission and congestion. But it's supposed to relieve some of that congestion to alleviate the need for additional transmission facilities.
But I will follow up and say that when we consider the 52,000 acres, which is the South Mountain region, we need to keep in perspective that, you know, this is a hotbed of rare and endangered, you know, habitat and species. And the more lines, the more infrastructure, even streets and roads, the more of that is laid down or dug or, you know, maintained overhead for overhead transmission, the more we're fragmenting that and the weaker we're making those systems. So just something to, again, keep in perspective. We've got to balance all of this to optimum levels.
And Steve and I were just commenting, in the model ordinance, the extension cord from the solar facility to the substation is to be underground, not overhead.
Okay.
And do you happen to recall how wide that corridor is?
For the Adams Solar project, I think it was 20 feet wide, a 20-foot wide easement where they buried the concrete bolt in the corridor.
All right, we have a couple more questions on the Zoom chat.
I think I see a couple up here as well.
There's a follow-up too really quick, just 1,300 to 1,500 per acre. Somebody has expressed it on the low side of what a conversation happened today just with Franklin County Conservation District. So that the comment was made, that's on the low side.
Maybe going up in some places.
Potentially.
Yeah. So we have a question about what we think the timeline might be for Pennsylvania allowing community solar. And the context for this actually is really interesting. In this municipality, we do not allow energy scale solar in our industrial and commercial areas because we don't want those areas with infrastructure, water, sewer, transportation to be quote unquote gobbled up. As soon as community solar is allowed, we would allow energy scale solar in those areas.
Really not new for that one.
I kind of thought it would have happened already.
Yeah, I mean, it's stuck.
Yeah.
It's stuck in the state legislature. It has been introduced for several years and it keeps being reintroduced. And is it that no action is being
It's in
taken?
committee.
Yeah. So there seems to be some roadblocks keeping it from even being discussed.
So this is regarding saturation, and it's for Sam. Can you provide an example of how to regulate saturation of solar in an agricultural district?
So you could have, and Steve can weigh on this, you could have a solar overlay zone and identify certain areas of the municipality where it would be located, or if you adopt a provision that says it has to be within X distance from a substation, that will effectively regulate that as well.
And I will add that the solar overlay zone, when we're looking at making really sophisticated decisions as we evolve in our understanding of this, could be very valuable as an approach because it allows us to take data that already exists about maybe sensitive habitat or historical resources or historic districts, recreational amenities and view sheds, and really assess within a municipality, where is it most appropriate to site the solar project and to have that be part of the decision-making process. So that's, yeah, another step that, you know, we could potentially help to facilitate.
Well, we have just a few minutes Oh, we have somebody in the audience. Wow.
So, I know you talked a lot about having rooftop solar. I've seen it a couple times, but what about, how does parking lot solar work in that? I know I've seen a couple times where there's solar panels layered like down the road that are parking spaces. So they not only provide shade in the parking lots, but I think a lot of cars in the summer can get quite hot. But it also allows, is a very open area that is quite good for getting sunlight.
I guess that runs the gamut between like sort of like a site specific solar generation development in most cases to being larger.
Yeah, that would be, in my thought, that's an accessory, which would be permitted in every district. It's just, I think, as we touched on earlier, it's getting those two entities to work together to get something like that installed, and liability issues and
Yeah, and we're actually exploring some of those types of options on campus. And what we've heard from folks on the solar development side is that really increases the cost of installing solar panels because of some of those liability issues, you know, and also having to construct them higher up and construct them in a way where they can get, you know, bumped by cars and still be structurally sound. So I think cost is a little bit more of a concern there.
But I will point out that that is in relation to the question asked by Holly about co-locating on warehouse rooftops. And again, it's about the coordination of the two parties. Mm-hmm. And we've got a system playing out with warehouse development in this region where it's entirely speculative, right? You don't know the end user. And so how are you expected to facilitate a discussion with that end user? Are we reaching a point where we can start recommending that they are built to spec, or at least like narrow them into like a type of user or something? Because the system that we have right now isn't even remotely, it's not even remotely plausible to have those two parties coordinate. Mm-hmm. And so that's a huge barrier that we need to overcome.
I think another thing to consider, and this just came to me, is when you're looking at a warehouse and you don't have somebody occupying the warehouse. If you design it for rooftops, and then that warehouse is bought by Hershey's Chocolate, and they need refrigeration units to keep their chocolate at 50 degrees year round, that's going to take away a lot of that area of the rooftop. Because from having panels, because they're going to have refrigeration units. And it gets even worse when you talk about the ice cream. So yeah, the end user is a good point. You don't know what's going to need to be included with that warehouse when they're going through that approval process and land development.
Yeah. We have another question. Yes, in the back.
Looking at Landsat, you can see all of the I-81 corridor and all these warehouses just blowing up their heat island effects. Is there any heat island effects coming from solar that's been addressed in rural areas that would normally be extremely cool, but are now getting increased temperatures from having large tracts of solar placed on the ground?
That's a great question.
So the folks from BP that I talked to at the site, I mentioned to them, not necessarily heat island, but I did mention to them reflection requirements. There's a lot of ordinances I've seen that say you can't create reflection. And they said, we don't want reflection. If it's reflecting, then we're not absorbing it. So the panels are designed to absorb the energy. I can't speak to whether that reduces heat island or not. That's just something that was pointed out to me, is they're trying to absorb all that energy, not necessarily reflect it.
So just in terms of my limit, like I'm reaching back into my brain about you know, the different types of energy that can be absorbed by different materials. We generally know that, you know, the soil and vegetation on top of the soil is like the ultimate at being able to absorb and retain heat. And so I don't know the final answer to that, but I would speculate that there would be at least like a little bit of, you know, raised temperature. I don't know that it would be significant at all, but just going By that logic, you would suppose so.
Dr.
Great
Hawkins,
question.
do you know of any?
No, but that's a really interesting question. Like, I'm wondering when you take like Adams County with a significant sized facility like that.
Yeah.
Sounds like a good student project.
Okay, we'll do one more
Well,
question. Yeah.
just to comment on that, like there is actually some evidence from very large utility scale sites that they do create heat islands. To the extent that they rival concrete heat islands from urbanization is not entirely clear, but they do create non-trivial heat islands, especially when they're very large.
Okay, well, we're coming up on 1 o'clock, so we'll wrap it up. I have one more comment from Mike, who I guess is at the Franklin County Conservation District. He says this is a monthly conversation at the FCCD. Many concerns have been expressed. So Katie, I think your comment about potentially having a series of workshops to kind of, you know, continue this conversation and provide some technical advice to some different constituencies would be a good way forward for sure. So thanks everyone for coming. Thank you all for joining us on Zoom. And the recording will be available on the CLUS YouTube channel in about a week. So, so you can revisit all of these conversations. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hey.